Welcome to the Digital Velocity Podcast, a podcast covering the intersection between strategy, digital marketing, and emerging trends impacting each of us. In each episode, we interview industry veterans to dive into the best, hard-hitting analysis of industry news and critical topics facing brand executives. Now, here are your hosts, Tim Curtis and Erik Martinez.
Welcome to this episode of the Digital Velocity Podcast. Today, we're going to be speaking with Mike Stopka, who's the president and owner of Design Toscano. Hello, Mike.
How you doing, Erik?
Mike has graciously granted some time today to talk a little bit more about his ever-expanding business in the world of online marketplaces. So with that, I'd like to take a moment and reintroduce Tim Curtis. Say hello.
Hello, everybody.
Tim and I will get started, and we're really excited to learn about all the experience that Design Toscano has had in online marketplaces. I've had the pleasure of knowing Mike for, I almost don't want to say this, 23 years, and have seen his business transform from a direct marketing company to a multi-channel business. It's been very exciting. So, Mike, tell us a little bit about Mike Stopka.
Chicago guy, kind of a blue collar type background, going through school, worked my way through. Used to work in the meat market, wrapping meat to get through. Truly no direction what I was going to do in college. Originally a geologist and sort of got into IS and was lucky enough to get my first job with Burroughs. Gave me training and ended up at multiple companies, the same mother company, but it was called Bank Tech. It gave me an opportunity to travel in my 20s and early 30s and to get experience with really, really smart people, and got to travel all over the U.S. for banks, utilities, insurance companies. I mean, I'd be on the road sometimes 5-6 times flights a week working with salesmen. I was able to get a lot of experience. It was almost a poor man's way of being a consultant at a time like Arthur Andersen, and gained a lot of modeling experience, a lot of business experience that I wouldn't have gotten. It was how I would get points and we'd travel to Europe all the time. That's sort of the foundation of my last 3 years of journey with Design Toscano.
So, Mike, I happen to know that you're an avid cyclist. Can you tell us a little bit about your cycling? Is it for fun? Is it competitive? Tell us a little bit about some of the places you've been.
It's always been a hobby, and actually, maybe later on as we go through the business, it was really sort of the reason why the business started. Back in my 20s and early 30s, I was probably the worst of the best in bike racing. Always hung around really strong riders and always just tried to hang on. And as we went through the 30 years of business, I switched to tandem with my wife because as guys get older, they don't ride as much. And we've continued riding. It's really one of the few things besides the business that we do. Places that we've been, because the nature of the business and what I like to do, we've been to Europe 60, 70 times. We've ridden just about everywhere, be it Switzerland, Austria, France many times, Spain. In 2 weeks, we'll be in Croatia. It is a fun way to see Europe or to participate in Europe. And it's a way to stay healthy and not go insane with all the stress of owning a business.
So 2 questions come up from that. 1, what's your favorite ride? 2, if you were to estimate how many miles you've ridden over the last 30 years, how many miles would that be?
Back in the racing days, I mean, there were 2 years of over 5,000, which is pretty good. Last year we did 3,500, the year before 3,000. So we've been pretty consistent on 3,000. I was going to do that as a project that try to estimate, I mean, maybe 100,000 miles. That one I have to qualify. I have to do some analysis. That's a spreadsheet project for a weekend.
You do like your spreadsheets. So Mike, tell us that one dirty little secret. Well, maybe not dirty little secret. Tell us that one secret or something that nobody else knows about you, except maybe Marilyn.
What I really do when I come home from work late, come home, get my 2-3 glasses of wine and sit there and watch YouTube. Very, very focused. It's amazing now what you could watch. If I want to watch bike riding in the island of Harv in Croatia, I could drill that deep. Or coming home and watching bike racing documentaries. Like last night was a Tour de Suisse. Tour de France is coming up. That's like a period that nobody talks to me in the evening. I guess that's the secret. Passion is you travel, bike riding, and gardening. At this point, I have people that help me garden, but that's probably it.
I know something else that most people wouldn't know, Mike has this amazing home that he built. When was the house completed? That was about 10, 12 years ago.
In 2011, after it burned down once, an English manor home. And it's actually, that's a whole different conversation. As a side project based on my business travels around both Europe and Asia to build a house from Asia, but having all the design and skills of the English history that we pulled from. I look back and sometimes I don't know how the hell I had time to work at the level that I did to get the house built. But again, it was truly a 20-year project.
Well, and you just launched a new website about the house, right? It's brookmanorhome.com or something like that.
Yeah, the background on it is you travel to Europe, and if you travel to some of these older castles like Downton Abbey, they need to open their house up to keep it paid for and for maintenance. So I'm working on that model right now because it does take quite a bit of maintenance, and I want to do a few things that are really kind of off the charts in the garden. So my wife lets me. We're thinking of renting out the house for movies and maybe a wedding or two. Actually, just this week we had a movie production company come in, I guess Netflix competition, walk through it, and that looks good. So 40 of my closest friends might be living in our house or being in our house for 4 weeks to shoot the movie.
That's kind of neat.
Oh, that's pretty amazing. So kind of shifting gears here a little bit, I'd love to hear how you got into the business. You mentioned geology. That's quite a swing. So how did that transition happen for you?
We'll go back to cycling. I had a friend who was extremely good. His name was Fabio. I knew from writing with him, his business was making statuary. And his family had been in the statuary business since 1910. Family came from Italy. I really was intrigued by it and my interest in Europe. So I was done with graduate school. Then it was about 1989. Then I said, Fabio, let me take your catalog and remarket it in the back of magazines. He says, sure. But he says, everybody thinks that they're going to sell the merchandise. So I took a $6,000 loan from my aunt, took his catalog, and literally on the kitchen table, we would pull the cover off, remarket it. I had it restapled because all the creative was done already. In the back of Metropolitan Home, we'd advertise for $5, buy this catalog. Then the business grew. I think it was like 90,000 the first year, 180 a second year, 360. Then when it got up to, I think about 3 million, I quit my day job. So without that relationship with Landis, that's kind of a common theme on leveraging opportunities that you see, be it other people's collateral, other people's money, or other people's products and intellectual property developed, and leveraging it into business opportunities. That was the start of it. Again, really was back a magazine only. It wasn't even a catalog at the time. And of course, the internet only existed for military people. It was kind of amazing. Actually, you talk about things that could block the business. I look back, Napkin Math, we've sold probably $1 billion of merchandise over the last 30 some years. If their family hadn't produced a catalog with a phone number on every page, there wouldn't have been a business because I wouldn't be able to rip off the cover. If they weren't willing to drop ship for me, if I didn't go out for ice cream with my family to Baskin and Robbins and walk into an art gallery and say, hey, can you answer my phones for me when I'm working for the next 4 years on my normal job? I'm always doing things, but after I traveling around the United States with Bank Tech, you're running a business from 40,000 feet up in an airplane. So it was, pretty cool.
Sounds a lot like today. One of my favorite stories with Mike was, this was probably 1999, and he was on his way to China and the laptop died. He said, hey, Erik, I need a new laptop. So we picked one up from CDW and ran through the airport to give it to him at the gate while he was getting on the plane to China. That's one of my favorite stories.
I mentioned that I'm kind of a Chicago guy. I think there's few people other than Erik that work harder than I do. That's pretty amazing too.
So, Mike, you talked about how you got into this business. And when you started, it was all direct marketing, it was print. You've gone through this amazing transformation from being just a direct marketing company to being mostly a digital marketing company. Tell us a little bit about that transition.
We've always had good sources in Asia. Once we went to Asia, we've always been, I think, product driven. But again, the beginning was back a magazine, catalog, and our website. So we're pure B2C. And my IT director at the time, a gentleman named Ben, said, you know what? You should start advertising with Amazon. This has to be 12 years ago, 15 years ago. And not knowing anything about it, but now looking at it, was a Seller Central account. I said, Ben, yeah, go ahead, try it. And to my amazement, I think we did like $300,000 the first year. And I says, wow, this might be actually a business. We got into the marketplace business truly by accident because it was an initiative, not from marketing, not from merchandising, but from IT, which is kind of counterintuitive, but that's where it came from.
So, question related to those marketplaces. The marketplaces were a bit of an evolution for you. Over the years, you continue to evaluate, go deeper in the marketplace. Is that an accurate statement? Or did you just dive headfirst into the marketplaces from the beginning?
It was an iterative process. You would take a couple steps, then take a couple more steps, and just learn from the experience. I mean, I knew at one point that with our 3P account doing as well, that I wanted to get some Amazon contacts, and it was almost impossible. And I kept trying to get a contact directly with a vendor manager. So I happened to be at the Las Vegas hardware show, and I walked into an Amazon session, and I mentioned who I was, and they said, we've been looking for you. We've been trying to get you. Actually, my VP of marketing was blocking it. That was the opportunity to get into Amazon 1P. Same thing with hay needles. In the beginning, it was kind of hard being a B2C, finding a niche or a contact to get in. That's actually going to be a common theme talking about each of the marketplaces is sometimes you need a secret door, or you need someone to shepherd you in to get into it. Because just most recently, we're launching with Target Marketplace, which is kind of a curated marketplace. We got into Home Depot about 2 years ago, and that would never have happened without someone to facilitate the process, someone to guide us with overstock. So it just evolves with time. At this point, I think we're in most of the places we want to be, but there's always still ground to move into as the marketplace develops.
I'm kind of curious, Mike, how many marketplaces are you in? And I know you well enough to know that there's probably no end number, but how many are you in right now? What kind of complexities does that drive for you?
Pure marketplaces, maybe 15. But again, we do sell B2B to a lot of smaller players that have their own websites, but they put the product on marketplaces. But as long as they keep the map, I really don't care, because if a smaller player can find a niche that we're not in, especially like in the eBay arena, you have to be so nimble and so low in the process. Smaller guys can do a better job. It's pretty shocking how complex it's got over the years. It's an evolution in the marketplaces where you could just get into FBA, 3P account, and start selling. The level of expertise that you need. I give sort of a speech every so often to the management team. It says the harder it is, the more complex it is, the better it is for us, assuming that we can keep up with it, because it keeps out people. It's much more difficult to get a starting position now in the marketplaces because of the complexity that's in there and the lack of people. Amazon used to be able to talk to vendor managers. We paid, I think, $250,000 once for an SBS, which is a direct contact at Amazon that would work half the time with us. Now, to get people, it's very difficult to talk to, except Wayfair. Wayfair has done quite a good job of keeping the people factor in, and I think that's why he's succeeded. So I think I've answered a couple of your questions, but it's become amazingly complex.
Here's a question for you. One of the things that we run into a lot, brands balance their exposure as a brand to the marketplaces, and they're also at the same time wanting to take advantage of a sales conduit. But it is a balance, and there are potential downfalls. I know there are clients who have been asked to expose their entire supply chain to Amazon in order to proof the supply chain. Well, that also gives insight into how they're building product. Of course, that became a point of tension, but it really is for many brands, it's a balance. How do you go about finding balance between protecting the brand, but yet taking advantage of the opportunities that a marketplace presents?
It gets back to product, and it depends on how exclusive your product is. So if you're selling toilet paper or batteries, you're screwed. The balance between marketplace, B2C, or B2B is difficult if you have a commodity product, in my opinion. But if you have a product that's long tail, I don't think it's that difficult, because it's sort of like Home Depot and Lowe's. Why do they use middle people? Because of all the logistics and all the value that middle layer brings to the table. The same thing with Amazon, Wayfair, Hay Needles. Without a middle layer, which is us, or to find these type of products, they wouldn't exist on these marketplaces. So I sort of have let the marketplaces and our B2C sort of reach equilibrium and make whoever wins, wins. As long as everybody competes at the same level with MAP so everybody has the same price, and it allows fairness within the marketplaces. You break MAP, which is always a problem to keep. If you're not familiar with MAP, it's minimum advertised price. And the definition of MAP is what the final consumer pays. So if you have a retail price and you ship that item, it's the price for the $100 item plus the $20 to ship. It's $120. Most marketplaces, if not all, it's free shipping. But of course, we all know nothing's free. So it's built into the price.
There's definitely nothing free. But let's go back to product development, because you said something about unique products versus commodity products in these marketplaces. You and I've had this conversation from time to time about the idea of building new products. How do you keep new products flowing into the marketplaces? Because it seems like they're heavily incented to just take bestsellers. How do you deal with that particular issue?
Like the catalog or any business, you need new products to feed the chain. In the old days with the catalog, you had to keep it very dynamic and keep moving because you had a set size universe. It was the rental size that you could get to. In marketplaces, if you think that Amazon accounts for, was it 50, 60% of e-commerce accounts for almost 30% of retail marketing, moving up to 50%. We're getting into niches in corners that we never would have before. As an example, we saw a lot of garden products, and gnomes is a category that really we never really sold for Design Toscano B2C catalog and web. But with the much broader net, it's one of our best-selling, or actually is, I think, our best-selling garden product is a gnome that moons. It's the Moony gnome. On Design Toscano, in the catalog, I barely get it in because our buyers don't want it. So you're hitting different markets, different nets are being thrown out. The holes for the net are bigger or smaller, depending on what you're trying to get. Going back to direct marketing, it's the bullseye. When you're selling in a catalog and you're buying SEM and you're going after a certain customer, the bullseye is pretty tight to make it cost effective. When you're Amazon, Wayfair, Walmart, it's a much, 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 much broader net, and you're able to pick up a lot of different products. So what you got to do is feed the engine, but it's not just feeding the engine now for your normal B2C, is now you have to account for what sells in marketplaces. People always ask, how big can you get? I would put a limit on the business in the early days because it was based on the universe, the ecosystem of a catalog and a website. With marketplaces, how big you could get is much, much, much broader. And actually your market share, because a lot of your competitors can't play in this game because it's not a B2B type business, is a lot of guys that are 50, 60 years old, they're not meant for marketplaces. Marketplaces and e-commerce is a young man's game. I'm not saying that someone over 50 like me, or maybe over 60 like me, can't play in the game, but it is a young man's sport. So I think people like us, like Design Toscano, can grow much, much larger now than it used to be when you were restricted to one channel, like a catalog or your website.
So you said something very interesting that I want to go back to. It sounded as if you were saying your direct consumers that are selling either through designtoscano.com or your marketplace consumers are two distinct different groups, and you have a merchandising strategy for both groups. Did I hear that right?
I mean, is it a real strong merchandise approach? No. But do we make modifications in our merchandising? Yes. The B2C should be able to sell it. There has to be a reason it makes business sense to put it in. So if I got a great deal to sell lawn chairs and I could make it work, I probably wouldn't make it work because it doesn't fit into the what Design Toscano is. But if someone said you could sell, I don't know, let's say a runner statue, which wouldn't fit into Design Toscano, but I know that there's a market out there and I could put it in a marketplace and our vendors can produce it, I would add that product. So yes, you fine tune your product, but it's not going to be a conglomerate type approach to products. We're not going to add things that aren't to our core competency.
It sounds almost as if it's a brand strategy, and the merchandise aligns with the brand strategy. It doesn't fit into a Design Toscano, whether that's designtoscano.com or the catalog. It doesn't necessarily fit, but the marketplace affords you more possibilities to have that kind of an independent placement.
Yeah, correct. I mean, if we found a niche that was big enough and we had the sources in Asia, would we go after it? Yes, but I would not call it Design Toscano, and I would put it to the side and silo it out. So it would sit, actually, you're getting real deep here. It is a venture capital strategy where you take the platform. So in what we've developed is we have a platform expertise to go into the marketplaces to sell our products, because we're really importers that have built the channel. But we could add other properties or go out there and get private equity to buy properties to put on that platform. So it's a different type of play. We're selling a platform to get into the marketplaces. And I think there's a huge opportunity, and that it will give you a much higher multiple if you could do that. That's sort of the challenge to develop that. And it's not just IT, but I'm sure we'll get a chance to start going into logistics and 3PLs and the complexity of what Bezos has introduced everybody. That's the long-term plan, is us or someone who invest in Design Toscano to expand the platform to a much larger entity than we are right now. And we're getting pretty big.
That's kind of an interesting business strategy, because I think you said somewhere you're over 60 and you're building this platform to bring products, unique products, into these marketplaces to sell. What's the value proposition to a potential investor or acquirer of the business? What do you think the most tangible thing is for the brand if I'm trying to buy Design Toscano?
If you're just buying Design Toscano, it's one-dimensional and straight EBITDA calculation. But if you're playing for a bigger picture, I mean, if you've been to the big shows like High Point or Atlanta, you walk down those aisles, those guys might have really nice products, but they don't have the expertise to bring it to marketplaces and really leverage it. They're more used to getting squeezed by Home Depot, Menards, Lowe's, what have you. The reason they do that is because this is a tough business to get in. It's a young man's business in that it's spreadsheet-based, internet-based. You start walking through and say, there's a tool company. And actually, I know the guy. You buy a tool company and you put it onto your platform. So it uses your API connections, it uses your logistics, it uses your accounting systems. An analogy would be back in 2006, I think it was, there was a big play in the catalog industry in the web business to roll up multiple titles under one entity and get the economies of one platform. That was done by a company called Cornerstone at the time. It was Ballard, Frontgate, Brandon Road. They built one giant warehouse in Ohio, and they had one accounting department, but they let the marketing and merchandise people run as separate silos. That was a 2006 strategy. I'm saying that there's a strategy now, and if for marketplaces, literally, if you look for it, there are people out there that are buying Amazon-based FBA companies right now. There's a whole marketplace and a bidding process for that business. I don't know much about it because I think it's scaled for smaller size than we are, but I think it's a great opportunity. And multiple wise, instead of having a one-dimensional multiple in that I'm a brand that sells statuary, garden, and home and gift items, you're selling a platform approach, which makes you into a full e-commerce company, which demands a higher multiple in theory. We'll see if it works at some point in the next few years.
Well, isn't that the case in all businesses? So, Mike, you're talking a little bit about infrastructure, and I know quite a bit about your business because we've worked together for 23 years. The question that I have is really around the idea of logistics, because, hey, let's face it, 20 years ago, you could have one warehouse somewhere outside of Chicago and distribute to the entire country. And it was expected that product delivery would take 7 to 10 business days. That model has been totally flipped, and logistics is a driving factor in most of our businesses today. So can you tell us a little bit about the challenges that your team has faced in getting those logistics systems up?
You look at the role models that are out there. So you're not a bleeding edge, and it's Bezos with 50, 60, 70, 80 3PLs warehousing across the United States. Then you have Nerj from Wayfair building out the Castlegate, which is another warehousing 3PL network. Sitting here with the crisis right now that's going on with containers and shipping, it's kind of the 1 day, same day, 2 day delivery is sort of a little out the window right now on a short-term basis, but it still holds true that that's the new gold standard. So if you're just a normal B2C selling your own brand and you have one facility in, let's say, St. Louis, to compete in the new world, you need to be able to get it to the consumer fairly fast, and you need to diversify your product. There's also a savings too, depending on the size and dimensional weight of your product. If you're selling t-shirts, you're just getting the 2-day flag or 1-day flag, have it in San Francisco, West Coast, Midwest. But if you're selling a little larger products, it's a big difference in shipping costs. So if you have a large TV that you're shipping from Reno to somebody in Los Angeles, it's a lot cheaper than shipping that TV from New Jersey to California. There's so many reasons why you want to have your product spread across the United States.
You have statues that are very UPSable or FedEx ground ready type products. Do you guys also sell really large furniture, statue items? So from a distribution standpoint, does that mean that you're going to parcel out some of that inventory across the country, or are you going to centralize that in the warehouses in the Chicago region and distribute from there?
For right now, in our size, it's Chicago. I don't want to get too deep academically, but I envision a bifurcated curve where it's an inverted dome, in that when you're selling in the middle size, it's where you should be spreading your products there, because you save on shipping and you get the 2-day flag or 1-day flag. As you get into smaller items, we're still in the analysis phase, because there really isn't as much savings with smaller items being closer to the customer. The cost of a 3PL warehousing partner, charging $5 to pick a $20 item is kind of hard. On the larger items, given our size, it makes sense to have it at a central location in Chicago. If hypothetically we were $250 million annual turnover, right? Then you could take a chair and put it in all 3 locations. But we can't do that yet because it's too cost prohibitive. In the middle part of that curve, it's perfect for having it distributed across the United States. I say United States, again, you talk about the complexity. I mean, we have 4, you got Reno for Design Toscano, you have Savannah, we're launching New Jersey with a partner. We're in Chicago, so that's 4. Wayfair has their own system, so that's another 6 locations that our product gets distributed. We're launching Canada right now in Mississauga. We've been outside of Manchester in the UK for like 8 years. Europe's been a little more challenging, but we've incorporated in the Netherlands, and we're having conversations about a 3PL in the southeast of the Netherlands. We're also in Castlegate in Germany, so we'll be there. So logistically, scale and the platform is pretty important, because it's like IT, it's needed for the marketplace in the future. Not to scare anybody that's listening to this, it's a little smaller size, because Amazon will do the lifting for you with FBA, or you could get a 3PL partner to help you get into it. And that's where a lot of Amazon's business has been, with small guys on FBA. But in my opinion, long term, Amazon's trying to squeeze them out, not because of trying to take over the market, is they don't have enough space. If you're a small player in FBA, you're going to have to go and find a 3PL partner someplace, because you can't count on Amazon. Right now, Amazon is having a space issue before Prime Day, and they're stopping people that are FBA from shipping their products in. So they're basically screwed. So if you want to control your own destiny, you need to have your own controllable 3PL network or your own facility. I gave you a lot of answers. Logistics is important to summarize it.
You're giving us a lot of insight into the marketplace selling. You may or may not be surprised to hear how frequently I run into brands that have no interest in selling in a marketplace. I'm just curious, let's play that out. What's your response to somebody who says that to you?
Well, let's just break the question to 2 factions, right? If you sell a product that's a commodity product, I'll use the classic batteries that Amazon screwed. I wouldn't sell on a marketplace, because you're going to have competition. You can't win the buy box. Your margins going to be compressed. In an economic model, it's the best deal for the consumer, because Bezos and these marketplaces are driving it to the lowest price. But if your product is exclusive, proprietary, hard to find, if it has a strong brand, I'd say why not? Again, retail, 30% of retail is e-commerce, give or take. It's going to be moving to 50%. If you're on the left-hand side of the ledger, you'd be insane not to get into marketplaces. Take an example, Nike's done, I think, a pretty good job. I have been told, I really haven't researched it, but that they sell their own B2C. Of course, they sell B2B, but they also share their products on marketplaces. It's key there that you can control your pricing. And Amazon understands that. I think Amazon has really, especially with the big name brands, allowed the brand to police the brand. And that's why there's an anti-Chinese move on Amazon, some of the platforms, in that not anti-Chinese as a nationality or a country, but it's for guys that would sell knockoffs or sanction Gucci purses or not sanction Nike shoes. So, look at it two ways. The product has to decide if marketplaces make sense, and if you can control it and control the price, and you have the biggest opportunity in the history of retailing. I mean, in the days when you just would sell to Home Depot or Lowe's or Sears, you're selling to a lot of end points. Now you have a lot fewer to sell to, and they could get to a lot more consumers. Again, I use an analogy. If I had a few years now, there used to be thousands of banks. I remember back in the 70s, coming out of school, they said that eventually there are only going to be like 10 big banks or whatever the number is. That's insane. It's going to be like Canada, where Canada only has 7 banks. Well, I think we're at that point in e-commerce that there's a natural economic scaling to oligopolies, and that these marketplaces are becoming oligopolies. I mean, the first to market and who gets market share, i.e. Twitter, i.e. Facebook, that academic basis footing is the same for marketplaces. So I think it's a great opportunity, and you should take advantage of it if you could deal with the complexities.
I think sometimes the marketplace, Amazon in particular, have been somewhat villainized in the conversation. The reason I mean that is, you're right. There's this realization that if you have been primarily a reseller, or you're selling commoditized product, there's no question that the world's getting more difficult for you. And as people move into marketplaces, or as they're trying, even on their own in a direct-to-consumer model, as they're trying to distinguish themselves in the grand scheme of things in terms of a selling space, it's not enough to just have the merchandise. The merchandise has to be that much better. It has to be unique. There has to be something compelling about the merchandise. If you're going to go to all the trouble of creating something unique, something that necessarily won't be as easy for a marketplace to try to counterfeit, well, there you have it. But brands are going to have to really focus and really get serious about the merchandising issue. It's been creeping up for years, but the rise of the marketplaces has really brought it to the forefront. Batteries is a great example. Everybody has read the stories, or if you're listening and you don't know, I would encourage you to Google some of the news stories about Amazon and the batteries and what they did to the battery sellers online. So it's all out there, right? It's all out there for people to read and understand. And that's been happening in large shopping clubs for years. Brands have been in there selling products. The products start moving. The shopping club creates their own version of it. The brand is out. So long story. But now we have to sort of focus on the importance of merchandising and really understanding that as you develop an Amazon strategy, or you don't develop an Amazon strategy, that's still an Amazon strategy. Deciding to not go the Amazon route, you still have to create a strategy to deal with Amazon. So you're not off the hook just because you decide not to sell with big bad Amazon. You're going to have to create a strategy to effectively carve your own way forward.
Tim, you make a great point. We know from working with Design Toscano over the past few years that we constantly are having conversations with Mike about Amazon or even Wayfair and a handful of others that we bump into in the search market very regularly and sometimes very aggressively. That brings a question, Mike. What's your view on, hey, we're doing advertising in our own search programs, whether they be paid or organic or social media, in Amazon and Wayfair, those two in particular, are also competing with you in those same spaces. And sometimes we see that overlap rate as high as 50 or 60 or sometimes 70%. How do you reconcile that when you're working with your team and as you're planning your strategies?
Well, it's obviously something that's a new concern in the last 5 years. But if you're still getting the ROAS that you need on each of those channels, and they're hitting different consumers. And if we were to do this, not that we ever did, but if you would take Amazon buyers that were on 3P and you were to model them and compare them to your house file, they're different. Amazon buyers are Amazon buyers, and they're not necessarily your brand buyers. Your buyers might overlap with Amazon. Take an example. You brought back my bicycle riding. So what I'll do is I'll go to Pearl Zuma, if I'm saying it correctly, the bike store, and I'll look up a jersey, and I'll go to the brand store and get all the information I need about the jersey, and I'll get all their emails, and then I'll order it from Amazon. I'm buying that because it's a logistics system that they could actually deliver the product to my doorstep in 1 day, 2 days. You can't look at each silo in that example as a standalone. It's the number of touch points. You see studies now, how many times does a customer have to be touched before they buy? So you let the customer decide what channel they want to buy the product on, and they buy it for different reasons. It leads into a question that's related to this sort of, Erik, we had conversations about that, branded versus private label. And I think that's a topic that's still on the table. I think MAP is more important to almost all this, because you want your partners to be making money. We just did a study with Amazon and making sure how much PPM, their margin they're making. You want Amazon to be making decent margin, like all your partners. Otherwise, they're going to take it out of your margin. I feel that if Wayfair or another brand wants to take your product, use your content, or maybe new content, that'd be preferable, and private label it, I think that's actually okay. I think Erik and myself have had conversations, beer talk, and Erik doesn't think it's a good idea, unless you changed, Erik, because I think it's more important to protect the MAP price than it is to keep the branding all the time. It's an opinion. We'll see if it plays out. CEO, founder of Wayfair, I've gone to dinner with him here at Design Toscano. We're decent size, but the joke is that I still have to pick up dinner. It just shows that he knows how important the players are in the marketplace, because Wayfair especially is nothing without people that sell on their platform, because Wayfair owns nothing for product versus Amazon with 1P they own.
They're a pure retailer in the old classic sense, right?
Yeah, they own nothing. They have all these warehouses, and what's inside of there, they own nothing for product. And so they need people like us. When you sit in these sessions, that when he meets with senior managers and presidents, he talks about the concept where they're getting close to that 90% of the products they'll sell will be under their brands. So they have different names and different segments that they're marketing to based on those brands. So if I don't even know the names that they use, but for our fountains, I know that we've private labeled our fountains with Wayfair, and they call it something, and it might be garden flowers. I don't know. They're marketing to the Wayfair consumer with a different brand. If I sell the product, it gets back, as we talk about merchandising, I see us almost originally as an importer that uses the channels. So it's the sourcing and the products, and I want to sell it through the channels. And as long as everybody competes fairly at the same price or higher, which private labeling allows them to do, then everybody wins, in my opinion. They'll have better margin. We'll sell more product.
How does that transition play out for somebody like Wayfair, where they're going to say, hey, we're going to take Design Toscano's products, let's say out of the 6,000 plus items, we're going to take the best 1,500 and we're going to sell that under a private label on Wayfair. Today, in the classic marketplace model, you're supplying all the content. You're supplying the creative, you're supplying the copy, you're supplying all the digital assets. And under a private label scenario, I would expect them to develop those creative assets.
Well, in many cases they do. They reshoot it, and they do a crappier job than we do. So that's actually a concern. The content writers can't be as good as us. And so we're always finding silly things like you'll have a statue that they have up there that's private labeled, and I'll make it up, it's David. They'll have the picture of David from behind, not the front of David. We go, what the hell is this? Come on, guys. So there's upsides and downsides of private labeling when the content gets involved. But they have their own resources.
I'm curious then, does that impact your brand? We've talked about this idea of balancing the brand with the marketplaces, but that's in the classic sense where you're somewhat competing with yourself or advertising yourself in multiple channels, right? I'm advertising myself in Amazon, I'm advertising myself in Wayfair, in Target, Walmart, whatever marketplace exists, and on designtoscano.com, you still have the brand authority and control. But the second they private label and it's still your product, how does that play? How does that impact your customer service team?
It wouldn't affect our customer service team. It would affect theirs because they own the transaction. But when they're private labeling, they're primarily doing it to have more margin. So if a buyer finds an iconic product, let's say the Bigfoot Yeti gnome for your garden on Design Toscano at $100, and they'll find the Yeti Wayfair's brand for $120. If they want to buy from Wayfair at $20 more, they'll buy it from Wayfair. But in most cases, the why they're buying is because they didn't find it on Design Toscano. That being said, they're not going to ever private label any iconic brand. So if there's something that is recognizable, that it's Design Toscano, they want to use that brand. They want to keep to it. That gets to things like where they have blenders or if they have coffee makers. You talk to the guys at Wayfair and they want to keep that brand and they want to leverage that brand. So that goes to Design Toscano with 7,000 products. If there's that mid-tier type product or upper middle that they could add 10, 15% more margin on it, they'll private label it. Again, that coming to fruition, the only thing that we've been 100% private label is on the fountains. And why it's important is that it's a commodity product. Let's say 10 people in the US that sell fountains from China, but they all come from the same region and maybe 4 or 5 factories. So that brand means more to Wayfair, it's more to the product to help sell fountains than having Design Toscano's name on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you're talking about an ecosystem that includes sellers who are selling branded and non-branded Design Toscano product. You're trying to sell in as many channels and reach as many consumers as possible. That's your business strategy, right? At the end of the day, you're not concerned, is what I'm hearing. You're not as concerned about brand dilution in that scenario because your products are unique.
Yeah, and it's big enough market out there because you get in the whole United States. I'll tell a story that my creative director was shooting in Florida. I think it was the Ringling Brothers Mansion. And we're doing a garden shoot. And people are going through the museum and the gardens. Where could I buy this? And he said, Design Toscano. Where can you buy this? Steve said, all these people in the US that want to buy a product, they can't find it. This is 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I said, unless we could go on TV and you get a large enough marketplace, that's the way it is. Meaning at the time marketplace, not the marketplace that we're talking today. And now everybody in the United States has an opportunity to find our products because with marketplaces, the size of Amazon and Wayfair and Walmart, you could get your products. We would never be able to sell in the store. You'd have a little margin. It's a pain in the ass to deal with the buyers, all the restrictions. But if you get those products on a Home Depot, Lowe's, or Target, the net is so much larger that you're pulling behind the boat and you're going to catch so many more fish that back 20 years ago when people wanted to buy our products at the museum, there was no way to get it to them. So you're almost approaching sort of, again, like marketing on TV, but not what TV used to be. Am I making sense, Eric?
Yeah, totally makes sense. I think it's a critical point because every brand, every business has to take a strategy about, like Tim said, whether to deal with Amazon or not to deal with Amazon, whether to deal with Wayfair or not to deal with Wayfair, so on and so forth. These are all the different considerations that you can think about in whether you want to employ that business strategy or not. I find it fascinating in terms of how you have actually transformed the entire company. And what I would consider 20 something years ago, you're the middleman in a lot of cases.
Okay, this is really going academic. In the UK, the ecosystem there is a little different that you only have 5, 60 million people there. We were in the B2B garden business. And vendors that sell in the UK are so hesitant to sell on Amazon because they only have a certain set of customers that they sell to. So everybody knows everybody in the UK. So that might be playing for somebody that's considering a marketplace if they're a bigger niche where they just can't sell on Amazon because it'll destroy 99% of their business. But what develops there is then a gray market. So wink, wink, they talk to somebody like, i.e. me, or they talk to somebody else that's a smaller player to get it onto a marketplace because they can't directly go there without screwing their core competency. The United States is much bigger, so that's less of an issue. But if you have a product that's much more mass market, the business case I just described in the UK can also play in the US, but size is what dictates that.
So I want to pivot and ask a question about your marketplace team. Tell me what it looks like today, and then I want you to put on the prognostication goggles and look and tell me what you think it's going to look like in the future based on what's happening right now with marketplaces.
It starts with your product merchandising content teams. They could do different versions of it. They could do a product for a marketplace, but that's where it starts. And I don't see that changing much unless you buy companies and have a separate silo. But then that sits on top of the platform. And today that's catalog and web. So that's our B2C. We have a B2B business. We go to, I think, 15 garden shows across the United States. Then we have Amazon and Wayfair that's underneath one umbrella. Then we call something web commercial, which will probably start to be split up as it gets bigger, which is Overstock, Home Depot, Lowe's, Target, eBay, a handful of more. Then there's another B2B business called Trade, which sells to smaller websites that find niches that we're not approaching: gift stores, specialty, movie companies. So that's sort of the multiple departments right now, given our size. But I think the key thing here for people who are in marketplaces or who are thinking of it is you need outside expertise on it, because you can't afford or you can't get the expertise from the outside. It gets back to the first question you asked me coming from bank tech. I was an expert when I walked into a bank on remittance processing, and I saw hundreds of customers, so I knew what was best practices. We can't possibly know what best practices is for all these channels. We have an expert team for Amazon and Wayfair. We have an expert team for Home Depot, Overstock, and eBay. So the team is, you got your merchandisers, content, then you have your different marketing teams, and then you need outside help. We knew immediately that we needed Amazon help when we got into it. At the time, there were really no consultants back, when we got into 1P, maybe 8 years ago. So we started, let's hire somebody from Amazon. And we tried to do it, and nobody from Amazon would even look at us, given our size. And we couldn't possibly afford what an Amazonian was getting. So those type of people in Seattle went to an agency, and that was the only way to get to somebody like that. But actually, one of our AMS was an ex-Microsoft executive in Bellevue, Washington. And when I was there, he says, what we would do is we'd go to the UK. UK people like to work with the US, and you're able to get things at a little more reasonable rate. So what we literally did was we asked our person in London, and I said, hey, do you want to work with us, be it as an employee or as an agency? They had planned on doing it anyway, and it was like marriage made in heaven. So we got them into the business, but we could never get as deep in the expertise and afford the expertise that we get from those two people. So our Amazon and Wayfair program is run from London with account manager in Chicago. You get expertise from our catalog industry. You always have to lean on outside expertise because it's too expensive unless you're a big player. People working on our website, you lean on the outside. So that's sort of my takeaway for somebody who's in marketplaces or want to get into marketplaces is you can't do it by yourself, and you need the outside to develop the infrastructure. Of course, you need your internal team to do a lot of the managing of those consultants.
That's awesome. I really appreciate all your insights. You guys have done an amazing job of transforming the business and building a really solid business in the marketplaces, and have year-over-year growth to support that. So we really want to be respectful of your time. So we just have a couple more questions for you. Sure. One of them is, we talked a little bit about what do you say to people who don't want to get into the marketplaces? What if you do and you've never been in before? What key advice would you give them?
Make sure you have a product that is special enough that you don't have to have direct competition, and leverage expertise from the outside. As you scale that, the expertise can be internalized. And Amazon gives you an opportunity with FBA as long as it stays healthy. eBay gives you an opportunity. Wayfair is a little harder to get into. Product is everything. You got to go back to the product.
Any other advice you'd like to leave the audience with today? Any pearls of wisdom?
I guess after 30 some years, I've been accused of too many analogies, but you just got to be able to change. And I'll go back to when we started on the kitchen table and I was copying other catalogers. You cut the paste, the catalog together and put the business together. And you look back after 30 years, let's say there was 100 people that were your counterparts in the catalog industry. There's, I don't know, maybe 3 left. And it gets back to you have to change and you have to morph. One thing looking back from the outside of Toscano, if a private equity guy ever comes and wants to bestow us with some money, is that you look at the longevity and the morphing of a company. And that leads into sort of your theme about marketplaces. If someone's not in a marketplace, you have to morph if you want to exist in the future. I close with the analogy is that when you travel in China, when we started in 2000, you'd be driving down when China was much more raw, and you go through these towns and you'd see a dog in front of the car. We'd all just put our hands in front of our eyes because you're going to run over that poor dog, right? Then I realized that the dog was probably over 10, 15 years old. So I would tell the guys in the car, he says, don't even worry because the dog's made it through 10, 15 years in the same situation. The chances of us running over that dog is non-existent. The reason is that the dog has made accommodations for its environment and changed over time. Your business has to change dynamically like right now. With the containers, we've had challenges, and I say this is probably the best we've ever done. It's also the most challenging and maybe the worst it's ever been. That gets back to change is a constant, and you have to adapt to the change that you're in business.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point right there, that change is a constant. Your businesses have to evolve. And if you're stuck doing the same thing today, in 5 years, you're not going to be around to enjoy the fruits of your labor. So I think that's a really important point. Anything else, Mike, that you'd like to offer before we go?
No, I enjoyed the process. It's actually kind of nice to verbalize some of the things that have been in my head or you've shared with individuals, but then never really in a concise form. Verbalizing things sort of helps bring business ideas to the top of the water. So Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. Well, everybody, that concludes this episode of the Digital Velocity Podcast. I'm Erik Martinez from Blue Tangerine.
And I'm Tim Curtis from Cohere One.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about how Blue Tangerine and Cohere One can help you generate more sales for your business, visit bluetangerine.com and cohere1.com. If you have enjoyed our show today, please tell a friend, leave us a review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the digitalvelocitypodcast.com website to send us your questions and topic suggestions. Be sure to join us again on the Digital Velocity Podcast.